Good morning, boys and girls. This morning I'm going to read Flat Stanley, the Australian Boomerang Bonanza. The story was written by J. Green Hunt and created by Jeff Brown. Chapter 1. The Grand Prize. Snow whipped through the air in thick blankets. Stanley Lamb Chop trudged on, trying not to flap in the wind. Up ahead, Stanley could just make out his younger brother, Arthur. "Keep going," Arthur's voice called. "We're almost there." Since the morning, Stanley Lamb Chop had awakened to discover that he had been flattened by the bulletin board over his bed. He'd travelled far and wide. He'd trekked through the Mexican jungle. He'd crossed the African savannah. He'd braved the Canadian Arctic. But this just might be his most difficult journey of all. And it's only the walk from school, thought Stanley. He strained to take another step, but the wind blew him off his feet yet again. He flew backwards into the side of a bush shelter with a slap. Stanley groaned. Since being flattened, Stanley could do all sorts of useful things. He could travel by mail, slide under doors, and fly like a kite. But being half an inch thick, he also had its disadvantages. It sure doesn't help one bit in a blizzard, Stanley thought. Arthur ran up. "Are you okay?" he cried over the howling wind. Stanley gritted his chattering teeth. "I hate this weather." Arthur nodded and held out his hand. "Hold on to me." Stanley grabbed his brother's outstretched mitten. Arthur leaned into the wind and battled down the sidewalk, dragging Stanley's body flapping behind him like a cape. "I wish we lived somewhere hot," Stanley grumbled. "Tell me about it," Arthur called over his shoulder. "Can you believe that right now it's summer in Australia?" "We could be on a beach," said Stanley. "If only I'd won that kangaroos contest," said Arthur. Kangaroos was Arthur and Stanley's favourite breakfast cereal. Several months ago, Arthur had cut out a form from the back of their cereal box and entered a contest whose grand prize was a trip to Australia. Nothing ever happened, though. Arthur pulled Stanley up the front steps of their home, pushing the door closed behind them. Stanley flattened himself against it and took a deep breath. A row of icicles fell from the side of his body. "Thank you, Arthur," he said. "I don't know how I would have made it without you." Arthur shrugged. "I don't know how you make it anywhere without me." He pulled off his boots. "After all, who was it that saved you on Mount Rushmore? Who solved all your problems over the telephone when you were in China? Who got us down that river in Africa?" "You are the one who dropped the paddle," cried Stanley, suddenly thawed under the collar. "I did not," replied Arthur. "You dropped the paddle." "I did not," huffed Stanley. "Arthur, is that you?" Their mother's voice called from the next room. Arthur held up his hand. "I'm just saying," he said in a low voice. "The next time you go somewhere, take me along, will you?" Then he added, "Especially if it's Hawaii or Florida." Stanley couldn't help it. He smiled. "Oh, you're here!" Mrs. Lamb Chop came bustling down the hall, her eyes fixed on Arthur. She seemed very excited. "Wait until you—" The smile fell from her face. "Why do you look like a wet dog?" Arthur scoffed. "I just walked through a blizzard." Their father, George Lamb Chop, appeared with a comb and started dragging it roughly through Arthur's hair. "Dad," protested Arthur. Mrs. Lamb Chop bit her lip and his socks were all wet. Their parents didn't even seem to notice that Stanley's socks were wet too. "What is going on?" Arthur and Stanley both cried. "There's someone important to see you, Arthur," Mr. Lamb Chop said in a strange voice. He stepped back to examine his handiwork and then wrinkled his nose. "Just say you haven't had a chance to wash up," he whispered, and led the boys into the living room. A barrel-chested man wearing a leather wide-brimmed hat was standing in the middle of the room. An official-looking young woman holding a clipboard stood behind him. Arthur stopped in his tracks. But you are—" he spluttered. Stanley stared at the man. He did look very familiar. "Good day, Arthur," the man said in an accent that sounded British. "Do you have something to say to me?" Arthur looked at him blankly. "I haven't had a chance to wash up," he blurted. The man's thick eyebrows danced up and down with amusement, then very mysteriously he said, "Isn't there something else you should say, mate?" Arthur gulped. He opened and shut his eyes. He swallowed. He pinched Stanley. "Ouch!" Stanley cried. "I'm not dreaming," Arthur croaked under his breath. Then in a very loud, careful voice he began, Suddenly Stanley knew exactly who the man was. "Jump for kangaroos!" He and his brother shouted together, hopping up and down in time with the words, just like in the kangaroos commercials. For the man standing before them was none other than Billy Willoughby. This could mean only one thing. "Looks like Arthur and a guest are coming with me to Australia," Billy Willoughby announced. The living room went wild. The woman with the clipboard clapped. Arthur did a crazy dance. Harriet Lambchop started to cry, and George Lambchop shook everybody's hand. Mr Willoughby himself slapped Stanley on the back so hard that Stanley flipped over. "I can't believe it," said Arthur. "I never thought when I cut out the back of the cereal box." "Never say never, mate," said Mr Willoughby. "So who are you going to take with you, your mum or your dad?" Stanley looked at the ground. He understood, of course. He'd gone on so many trips without Arthur, it was only fair that Arthur got to have his own adventure for once. And then Arthur did something that surprised Stanley even more than an Australian billionaire showing up in their living room and giving away a trip to the other side of the world. He said, "Can Stanley come?" 2. The Aussie Crew. It had not been easy for Arthur to convince Mr and Mrs Lambchop to allow him and Stanley to travel to the other side of the globe without them, but the rules of the contest stated clearly that only 2 people could go, and Mr Willoughby and his assistant Miss Perth both promised that the boys would be carefully looked after. Now, the Lambchop family stood on the tarmac in front of a small private jet saying their goodbyes as snow fell lightly around them. Mrs Lambchop hugged Stanley and Arthur tightly. Finally, Stanley whimpered, "Mum, you're going to wrinkle me." "Oh, of course," she said, letting them go and forcing a brave smile on her face. "You know, there's a great deal of unusual slang in Australia, such as rhyming slang, where a rhyming word is used to signify another word. For instance, dog and bone means telephone, and plates of meat means feet. Isn't that fascinating? Did you know?" "Mum," Arthur groaned. "We'll be fine, ma'am," Stanley said, more gently. He knew his mother was just rambling about the English language to make herself feel better. After all, it was her favourite subject. Mr Lambchop put a comforting arm around his wife. "Stanley," he said, "you are a more experienced traveller than your younger brother. We expect you to stay with him at all times." Stanley saluted. "Arthur," said Mr Lambchop, "keep the flat kid out of trouble." Arthur cracked a smile. Mr Lambchop said nothing for a moment, and then he stepped forward and put his gloved hands on the boy's shoulders. Stanley could feel it resting on the edge of his body near his cheek like a warm blanket. "Do you solemnly promise that you will take care of each other no matter what?" "We promise," intoned Arthur and Stanley. Behind them, Miss Perth had stepped out onto the top of the metal staircase that connected the plane to the tarmac. "Time to go," said Arthur, and before their parents could say another word, he grabbed Stanley's hand and sprinted for the plane. "Bye, Mum. Bye, Dad," called Stanley, his body once again flapping in the air behind his brother. "Wow," said Arthur, bouncing up and down. "Leather seats." "Arthur, Stanley, I'd like to introduce you to a few people," said Miss Perth. An unshaven man wearing shorts, a t-shirt and hiking boots ambled into the aisle. "This is Mr Billabong, Mr Willoughby's butler." "You don't look like a butler," said Stanley. Mr Billabong grinned. "Yeah, well, you don't look like a person, but you are, aren't you? Call me Bongo." "And this," continued Miss Perth, "is our chef, Sheila." She was an athletic-looking woman with curly red hair. "How do you do, boys? Hope you like Vegemite." "What's Vegemite?" asked Arthur. "I was hoping you'd say that," cried Sheila, producing a plate from behind her back with 2 pieces of toast spread with a thin layer of dark brown jam. "Try some." Arthur and Stanley each took a piece of toast. Exchanging looks, they took a bite. Stanley stopped chewing at once. It tasted like beef stew with old socks. "Isn't it ace?" said Sheila excitedly. "That means great," whispered Miss Perth. "Oh, yes," said Arthur, his eyes watering as he forced himself to swallow. "May we please have some water?" Stanley croaked. "2 waters coming right up," Bongo said. "Are you ready to see the pilot?" Miss Perth asked. She led them to the front of the plane and opened the door to the cockpit. The pilot turned to greet them, and Stanley and Arthur gasped. It was Mr Willoughby himself. "Take a seat, co-pilots," the billionaire said, his eyebrows dancing. "Let's get this boomerang in the air."